All right. Well, prayer requests, if there's anything to mention, we'll take those. And do you remember Miss Charlene be going this week down to Vanderbilt? I guess you're leaving tomorrow. Is that right? And having surgery on Tuesday. So pray for them and Miss Boer particularly, but surgery and traveling and everything there. So remember them if you would in prayer. A couple of our sickos are back with us today, and glad to see them. And
I would like to say thank you to the Lord and for the people who pray. And really, you don't realize how bad you miss church and how privileged people are to have the ability to come to church. You know, a lot of people just won't come, and I'm grateful to be back.
Yeah, and glad to. Lord's able to heal and to help, and thankful for that. So, still other folks are sick. June Conley, Schaefer are both sick still, and again. But remember them and others that aren't able to get out and things. So, Lord knows their situation, knows the need, and He's able to help in those. But this week, Chloe and Joseph. They're both sick again so which Chloe's not real sick. She didn't even know she had it until she was tested. This routine test they did, but she had some minor symptoms so far. Hopefully the Lord be gracious there and she can get through that pretty mildly. But pray for them if you would. Anything else make mention of? All right. Well, we'll pray and ask the Lord's help for Sunday school time and for these requests. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you that you are good, and we thank you that we can bring our requests to you and you tell us to, and we're thankful for the privilege of coming to you in prayer, and you tell us to let our requests be made known. And Lord, we do that because we know that you're willing to listen, you're willing to hear, and Lord, you're able to help in every need. We pray that you'd bless these that were mentioned. Lord, some are sick and some are facing surgery, and we pray that you'd help Miss Boer this week. And Lord, others that are sick, we know that you're able to bring us through those things we face in life. We pray you'd be with us today as we look at your word, and Lord, that you'd be honored in it, and we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. So the book of Proverbs is where we'll be. We'll actually take these next three books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. We want to kind of put these together, and read. The reason for that is because they all were written or compiled by the same man. That was Solomon. We're not certain as to the order in which they come. Of course, our Bible has them Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, but as far as chronological order, it's not real certain. But three poetic books. Now, Solomon did not write all of the Proverbs. We know that, but he did he wrote most of them, and he kind of assembled them, I guess you'd say. You get to chapter 30, of course, it's the words of Agur, the son of Jacob, even the prophecy. And so not all of them were written by Solomon. Some of them are attributed to Solomon. In chapter 25, you have specifically, these are also Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah copied out. The beginning of chapter 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And so generally we think of Proverbs, we think of Solomon wrote them, but he didn't write all of them, but he did write most of it, and he compiled it he was kind of the author of most of it. And then the book of Ecclesiastes we attribute to Solomon, and the Song of Solomon, written by Solomon as well. And they're all poetic, and that's something that you have to understand too. And we talk about that some in the Psalms, is the poetic nature of what we're reading. We talk about taking the Bible literally. What does that mean? And independent Baptist people, that's one thing that you hear that pretty firmly sometimes is, well, we believe the Bible's literal. We believe it means what it says. Well, it does, but we can't take it away from its literary context either, which is Proverbs is poetic, Psalms is poetic. It uses a lot of comparisons. It uses a lot of things, and we have to understand the nature of Hebrew poetry in a sense, at least. And understand what's going on there. You find the same problem when you get into some of the apocalyptic writings, things like that, and Daniel and Revelation and things. You have to understand these were written, and some things are not literal. There's not a beast rising out of the sea in Revelation. And we understand that much, that represents something else. And so the same thing with Proverbs and Psalms, and even Job has a poetic nature to it. Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. These are things that are that we understand as a lot of times it's comparisons. There's a lot of imagery involved in these books, and a lot of symbolisms in some of these things. So we have to understand it that way. Now, is the Bible to be taken literally? Yes, it is. And that means to take it in its literary context as well as its historic and cultural context. And on all kinds of contexts, it has to be understood when we read our Bibles. So the book of Proverbs is kind of one of the most practical books of the Bible. It is very plain, though there are a lot of some imageries in it. It's a pretty plain book. It's a pretty straightforward book. It's written to teach us how. It's focused at practical living. And he starts in verse number 2 of chapter 1, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. So here's the purpose of the book of Proverbs. It is to point us in the direction of wisdom. Now, the book of Proverbs doesn't claim to be all wisdom. It doesn't say, okay, this is wisdom, you learn this book and you've got it down pat. It says these are some wise sayings, keep searching out for others and find wisdom for it. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes it has to be dug out and searched for and those things. What is wisdom? What do we mean when we say wisdom? What is wisdom? What does the word itself mean? Well, I think wisdom just means skill. It's the ability to use our knowledge properly. You can know some things and still be unwise if you refuse to use what you know properly. Instruction, he speaks about instruction of wisdom, of instruction of justice in verse 3, instruction of judgment and equity, those things in verse 3. So we were looking for wisdom in this book. We're looking for instruction in wisdom in this book. He's teaching us how to find wisdom. And so to perceive the words of understanding, it's just able to see those things that are revealed to us. And this is not just a book of quaint sayings, but it gives us the ability to see aright what God would have us to see. He talks about in verse number 3, the instruction of wisdom, and of course that's part of it, but the instruction of justice. Well, what is justice? Wisdom is using what we know properly. Justice is treating others properly. Justice is doing right. It's doing right in how we treat others. If you're a just man, that means you treat everybody the same. And you treat everybody not just the same. You could be a wicked man and treat everybody bad. But to treat justly is to treat people, is to treat people and situations in a proper manner. And that comes from having wisdom. An instruction of judgment. What's judgment? Well, you're not supposed to judge, is what the world says. You can't judge me, people say. But the Bible tells us to judge. We're to have judgment. And we make judgments every day. Every decision we make is a judgment. And we're deciding, is this right or is this wrong? Should I do this or should I not do this? And so that's judgment. It is knowing and understanding the difference between right and wrong. We need instruction in those things. We need instruction of wisdom. We need the instruction of justice, how to treat each other properly. We need instruction in judgment, in how to know what's right and wrong. If we don't know what's right and what's wrong, then how are we going to do what's right? And so we have to have judgment. And the book of Proverbs gives us examples of things in practical life that helps us see right and wrong. That's what the book does. And it helps us lean towards and seek out wisdom, the ability to do right and use our knowledge properly. And then he speaks about the instruction of equity in verse 3. Equity is right and wrong across the board, and that does away with, and that's just being equal. That equity, you think about equality. Equality and equity is not the same thing, but they're similar. But to be equitable, to treat people the same. Justly is to respond rightly to a situation. That's justice. Judgment is to know how to respond to that situation, and equity is responding the same way when that situation comes up. That's equity. So concerning wisdom, of course, we think of Proverbs, that's what we tend to think of, is wisdom. It's a book of wisdom. But 54 times in the book you'll find the word wisdom, 42 times you find the word knowledge, and 25 times is instruction. So that tells you what the book's about, doesn't it? It's wisdom, it's knowledge, it's instruction in all those things. So in the beginning, how do we gain it? How do we gain wisdom? Wisdom begins with knowledge. Wisdom is using knowledge aright. So how do we gain wisdom? Well, the beginning of wisdom, chapter 1 and verse 7, if wisdom comes from knowledge, you have to have knowledge to be wise. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Knowledge comes from a desire for instruction because we're seeking that knowledge, and then we take that knowledge, and when we act rightly upon it, that's acting wisely. If we're going to be wise, we have to have good knowledge. But to reject knowledge is to despise wisdom and instruction altogether. And she's talking about, being in church, and people say, well, I just don't think I need church. And I think that's one thing. I was talking to somebody this week, and one thing that has come of this COVID and all this stuff, and I think what has happened is many people, and I was talking to another fella this week, he's talking about how their church has really changed over the last couple of years, and I think what's happened is COVID has given people an excuse to not be in church. It's given people the idea that they don't need to be at church. Well, I've been a year without it. Why do I need to go back now? I think a lot of people feel that way. And of course, nobody's going to tell you that, but I think empty churches prove it, because it's not uncommon. This is a common thing that you'll see all over the place, and there's some churches that are maybe the experience is a little different, up or down or what have you, but generally speaking, churches are down in numbers. And I think the whole idea that, I haven't been in church for a year or 2 years or whatever, and I'm doing just fine. I think that's where a lot of people are. But what happens is we need instruction in knowledge before we can ever live in wisdom. And that's one of the purposes of the church that Paul gives us, and that is he gave some apostles and prophets and teachers. Why? For the perfecting of the saints for the work of the ministry. The church house, the meeting house, should be a schoolhouse for the saint. Now, it sounds good when people come up with these cliches and things like that, well, it's not, and I've heard people say things, and it's like, the church isn't supposed to be a museum for the saints. It's supposed to be what is it? You hear this all the time. It's supposed to be a hospital for sinners. Well, that sounds good, but that's not scriptural, because the scriptural definition is it's to be a place where the saints are built up so they can perform the ministry. That's the goal of the church, of the assembly, of the meeting house. That's why God gave pastors and teachers, so that we could be taught knowledge, so that we can take that knowledge and act upon it wisely, and then the church would be built up and sinners would be helped. And certainly sinners should be helped in the church, and I'm not totally against that little saying there, but you hear that often, and it's not completely right. But the beginning is the fear of the Lord. If you don't fear God, you're never going to live wisely, scripturally wise. And a person who is truly wise will understand and hearken unto the Proverbs. And you look through the book, and there's so much practical things. It speaks against fornication, adultery, drunkenness, all sorts of immorality, pride, lying, all kinds of other sins, and all these things that are common in the world. The Proverbs says, here's where it's going to get you. If you do this, here's the problem that's going to come from it. And so Proverbs explains a lot of things. Why should you not sin in this manner? Well, Proverbs says, because if you do sin in this manner, here's the common result of it. And there's all kinds of examples of that. You go to chapter 6, just looking here, verse 32. Whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. Okay, so why should you not commit adultery? The Ten Commandments in the law says, thou shalt not. Proverbs says, here's why you shouldn't. Whoso committeth adultery lacketh understanding. He that doeth it destroyeth his own soul. A wound and dishonor shall he get, and his reproach shall not be wiped away. For jealousy is the rage of a man, therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance. You know what happens? A man commits adultery with a woman. You know what happens? That there's another man involved. And you're stirring up vengeance in that fella. And you're putting yourself in a dangerous place. He's not going to regard any ransom. He's not going to, look, you can try to apologize. You can try to say, man, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I'll buy you a new car. I'll do whatever. That fella's not going to forgive you for that. And so that's the reason why you don't do these things. And so Proverbs is full of these things. 7:24 speaks about, you have to go all the way up to the woman, the harlot woman in verse 10. She has the attire of an harlot, the strange woman. This is about being attractive or seduced by a strange woman. Why do you not do that? Why is fornication bad? Well, because she has cast down many wounded, verse 26, yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. You are setting yourself up for a life of destruction when you do these things. That's what the Proverbs is telling us. Chapter 8, verse 18. Here's the reward, though. Here's the reward. He's speaking about wisdom. He says in verse 16, by me princes rule and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. I love them that seek me, and those that seek me early shall find me. Okay, so why should I not do those things? Adultery and fornication, these other things that are mentioned. There's a common reward for those things. But if we seek wisdom and live wisely, there's a common reward for that as well. And he says, riches and honor are with me, yea, durable riches and righteousness. That's wisdom. My fruit is better than gold, yea, than fine gold, and my revenue than choice silver. I lead in the way of righteousness in the midst of the path of judgment. He says, wisdom, living wisely, will keep you from a lot of bad consequence, while living a life of sin will lead you into a lot of bad consequence. And that's what Proverbs is saying. Look, learn right and wrong. This is wrong because. This is right because. There's a reward for these things. Everything's going to carry its own consequence. Verse 16 of chapter 10. Chapter 10, verse 16, the labor of the righteous tendeth to life, the fruit of the wicked to sin. There's a lot of the Proverbs in one verse. The labor of the righteous tendeth to life, the fruit of the wicked to sin. A life of wickedness, a life of sin, generally leads to poverty. Generally. Now there are some wicked that prosper. And that's where Psalm 37 comes, or 37, 70, I get mixed up. One of the Psalms that talks about why is the wicked prospering? But then he sees their end. Now there's some exceptions to these things, but these are general things that we can see in our everyday life too. Chapter 15, verse 10, we'll get a couple more and we'll move on to the next book. Proverbs 15, verse 10. Correction is grievous unto him that forsaketh the way, and he that hateth reproof shall die. Why do you need instruction? Why should you seek instruction? Because to do so, you're leading yourself down a destructive path. And hell and destruction are before the Lord. How much more then are the hearts of the children of men? Those who will despise correction and despise instruction will reap the effects of that. And you know, you try to lead people right, and you try to teach people right and tell people right, and when they refuse that and reject that, they'll soon find that there's good reason. That it's not just, these aren't just, the Bible isn't, and the commands of God aren't just rules to be followed. Because God gives us, and you see it in the book of Proverbs, there are reasons and there are rewards for doing right. And there's reason and there's a reward for doing wrong. Therefore, seek wisdom, seek knowledge, love instruction, because it will lead you in a path of righteousness and life. And it's pointing us to Christ in all. Chapter 23, just one more here I had jotted down. Chapter 23 and verse 31. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. Don't even consider it. Don't look at it, he says. Well, why not? Why? And people talk about, why are you against drinking? Why are you against alcohol? Well, I believe the Bible's against it. Verse 32, at the last it biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder. What does it lead to? It leads to adultery. It leads to fornication. Verse 33, thine eyes shall behold strange women. Verse 34, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as lieth upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it yet again. Isn't that the life of the drunkard? I'm not going to do this again. Next thing you know, they're right back at it. They've stricken me. Wounds, and the Bible speaks about wounds without cause. Who hath woe? Who hath wounds? Verse 29. Who hath babbling? That's where the drunkard babbles, ain't it? He's babbling. Who hath babbling? He hath tarried long at the wine. Who hath wounds without cause? How'd you get that bruise on you? I don't know. I was just... They're beat all to pieces. They can't walk. They can't talk. They don't know what happened. They can't remember things, supposedly. Well, I don't remember. I think they remember a lot more than they let on, the drunk. But anyway, who hath redness of eyes? Here's obvious. Proverbs tells us how to recognize the drunk. He's a babbler. He has wounds without cause. He has red eyes. Easy to recognize, isn't it? There's three things that'll just turn them out, won't it? But they're slick. They think they're slick, don't they? Look not thou upon the wine when it's red. People say, well, the Bible, Jesus turned the water into wine. Well, He did. And you know what? They didn't have a different word for alcoholic wine and juice. It's all wine. And so you have to determine, when you read your Bibles, when it talks about wine in a good sense, it talks about the presses bursting forth with wine. Alcohol doesn't come from a press. Alcohol comes from fermentation. When it speaks bad towards wine, it's obviously speaking about the alcoholic wine. When it's speaking good towards wine, it's speaking about the fresh grapes, the fresh harvest, the fresh presses, those things. And what Jesus turned to wine, people say, well, they had to ferment it to preserve it. I don't know why I get on this, but I do every time I talk about this stuff. Well, they had to ferment. That's the only way they could preserve it. It's because they could ferment it. No, that's a lie. You go to the store and you buy juice right now that's not fermented and it's preserved. Why? Because it is either cooked to a point where it kills the bacteria, or it's sealed in some manner, or however you do it, you can preserve it. Matter of fact, they were capable of preserving fresh grapes from season to season. They could almost last to the next season. Preserving grapes underground, just like we would in a cellar or something like that. They learned how to hang them and how to preserve them in underground cellars. We call it cellar. And so these preachers get up and say things like this. Well, they had to ferment it to preserve it. And one more while I'm at it. When it talks about putting new wine into old bottles. Well, there's another reason. Well, you can't put that new wine in old bottles because that fermentation, it swells that bottle and bursts it. That's not what it's saying at all. What he's saying is what was their bottle made of, first of all? It was made of a goat hide. And it was leather. It was a leather bottle that from one use to the next, that bottle would become dry and hard. And so you put the new wine into new bottles because you don't want to lose it. You want to preserve it properly. It's not because it's going to swell and bust the bottle. It's because the bottle is already aged. And when you put that wine in there, that bottle stretched to a point, and that's where it stayed, and the wine was preserved. And if you try to stretch it again after it dried out and settled, you would rupture it. If you put you're not going to take the risk. You're not going to take the risk of losing that precious, fresh blood of the grape by putting it into an old bottle. That's what Jesus was saying. It has nothing to do with fermentation. And I can show you all kinds of stuff on that. So the idea that, well, Jesus turned it to wine, Jesus talked about fermented wine in old bottles and that kind of stuff, that is all wrong. And you can look that up. If people were really willing to search it out, seek out wisdom. That's what Proverbs teaches us to do. And so that's what the book is. A lot of practical things. You get into chapter 30 and 31, they're attributed to other people. The words of King Lemuel. chapter 31. This is thought to be Solomon, but unsure completely. I'm not totally sure about that. Then we come to Ecclesiastes, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, who else in the world could that be? That's Solomon. And this book is about the purpose of life. Now, the first Proverbs is practical living. Ecclesiastes is, I guess you say, purposeful living. And Ecclesiastes tells us what it's like to live a life that's all about ourself. It's all vanity. That's a common word that you find in this book, and kind of the common theme of this book is everything's vanity. It's all nothing. It's what vain means, nothing. It's nothingness. Life without a focus and without a purpose lived toward Christ and towards God is a life of vanity. It's a life of uselessness. Chapter 1 and verse 3, what profit hath a man of all his labor which he hath taken under the sun? He's basically, in verse 4, he's like, one generation comes and people come and go and come and go and come and go, but the earth's still here. Our life on this earth, if it is not lived for God, is useless. To what benefit is it? That's what this book is about. So vanity, vanities, common words in this book. Everything that we have stays here. Everything in this life that we have and own will stay here. I heard it, I don't even know where I heard it, but someone said you can't take everything with you. The Egyptians tried it and all they got was robbed. They'd bury all their wealth with them, thinking I'm going to take it into the next life with me. And now where is it? It's in museums all over the world, isn't it? Because somebody dug it up and stole it. You can't take it with you. And like one preacher said, if you want to try it with you, I tell you what, you just give it all to me and I'll write you a check. You can be buried with a check. I'll write you a check and bury you with it. Give me all your money and I'll write you a check and bury you with it if you want to take it with you. You're not going to cash that one, are they? But everything that we have and do in this life will remain here. He said, generation comes, generations go, but the earth remains. And he gets to the end, and this is basically everything in this book is what it's like to live a life of selfishness. Everything here's, people live, people do this, and they do all these things. They have these parties, and people build big empires, and people do all these things. You can become a king, you can rule over a lot of people, but in the end, what does it matter? Chapter 12, he sums it all up, and he says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Then chapter 12 and verse 13, the whole end of the matter. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Solomon says, I've lived that life. I've had it all. I've done it all. I've tried it all. I've had it all. There is no satisfaction in anything this world has, but here's what I've concluded. You fear God and keep His commandments. That's our duty. It's not about what we have. It's not about what we gain. It's not about what we're able to build. It's not about some legacy that we leave behind. It's about what will we do for the glory of God, because God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. We will answer to God for what we do and how we live. Proverbs says, live practically. Ecclesiastes says, live purposefully. Live in a direction toward God. Song of Solomon. Now, this is an interesting book because there's a lot of strange interpretations this book. First of all, it is a story between a man and a woman and their love for one another. I believe, secondly, it is a picture of Christ and His church and the love they're to have to one another. The purpose of this book is to attempt to put into words the minds of two people who are truly in love with one another. Hallmark tries their hand at it regularly, don't they? But Song of Solomon is a good one. It's a story. It's a love story. And one thing that's hard about Song of Solomon, you have a dialogue going back and forth. You have the man speaking to the woman speaking to the man. You have the man speaking to others, the woman speaking to others. Sometimes it's hard to figure out who's talking. That's one of the difficulties. Because it doesn't just explicitly say, and he said to her all the time, or she said to him. It's just kind of like you're reading it as if they're speaking to each other and you don't have the fill in the blank, he said, she said. So you kind of have to picture in your mind this conversation going back and forth, and you have to kind of figure out who's talking sometimes. So there's a few places, there's some difficult places where you don't know who's speaking. But when you read in verse 2, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. We know the woman is speaking. I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. That's the woman speaking here. Verse 8, you see it change. If thou know not, O thou fairest among women. So now the man's speaking. She's saying, she says, don't look upon me because I'm black. The sun hath blackened me. But the man turns around and says, here's what you don't understand. He says, you're the fairest among them all. And and this woman speaks about, you have all this back and forth in chapter 2 and verse 1. You have, I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys, the man says. As the lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. He says, I'm in a high position. I'm the rose of Sharon. I'm the lily of the valley. People look at me. But I want to tell you, when I look out and I see you, all I see is a bunch of other thorns, but you're my lily among the thorns. Beautiful, isn't it? And when you think about that as Christ viewing His church, Christ looks at the world and He sees nothing but thorns and thickets. But down there in the middle of it, He sees a lily among thorns. And that's us, His people. And God looks at us, and Christ looks at us as something beautiful. In spite of how we may feel about ourselves, we look at ourselves sometimes and we think, man, I'm just worthless. I don't deserve anything. Why'd God even save me? I don't know why. And He looks back at us and says, here's what you don't realize. I see you as a beautiful thing. Song of Solomon tells us to live with a love to Christ, a rightful love to Christ. If we're living in wisdom and we're living with an attention towards God, then that brings in our heart a love for Christ that we see in Song of Solomon. I'm glad they're in this order. But Paul speaks about being espoused to Christ. Chapter 4 of Song of Solomon. Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in thee. You see how it's the poetic it's a poetic book, isn't it? It's in chapter 5, verse 10. My beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000. His head is as the most fine gold. His locks are bushy and black as a raven. Is his head really gold? Back to that taking things literally. Does he really have a gold head? Is his eyes, are they really the eyes of doves washed with milk? He's describing the goodness of him. His cheeks are as a bed of spices. And there's some strange descriptions because we're not ancient Hebrews. Some of them are very strange. But and that's how we look at it, though. We understand that it is poetic. We understand it's trying to put into words an expression of the heart. And that's something we have a hard time with sometimes, isn't it? That's why I think good music is good. Good hymns are good for us. Why? Because they often put into words what we're thinking, but we just don't know how to say it. And so we're able to sing it. That's why some of these old hymns are so wonderful. When you think about Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. We know that, and that's what we feel, and that's what we know, but when we can sing it, we're able to put into words what's in our heart. That's what Song of Solomon's doing. It's putting into words what's in the heart of Christ as Solomon and what's in the heart of his people as this woman, the fairest of women, the fairest among women, and he's the fairest of 10,000. A lot of the Lily of the Valley, that song we sing, comes from Song of Solomon. I've found a friend in Jesus. He's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. We just read that, or I just saw it at least. So we saw the lily of the valley. I'm the lily of the valley, verse 1 of chapter 2. And that's where we get that song. So Proverbs teaches us to live practically. Ecclesiastes teaches us to live purposefully. And Song of Solomon teaches us something about how we live privately. Everybody doesn't see how much you love the Lord. But you know it. You know it. And I believe the Christian will hold Christ in high regard, and we seek to do those things that are pleasing to Him. And there's a great beauty in that. And we're like these two in Song of Solomon, who they long for one another, and they seek for one another, and they find pleasure in one another. So, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs, all by, or at least put together by Solomon, and kind of a different aspect. They're all similar books, but a different focus of each book, isn't it? Any questions?
I have a question in Proverbs, and if it's too long, that's fine. There is a big debate over wine and alcohol, and my question is, back at that time, do you feel like from harvest to harvest, it would have just stayed juice? And I don't know about fermentation and processes. If they had to keep it just to set it at the keep, like was it an accidental discovery where they were just trying to store it, or is there a process? And then the third part of that is where the Bible tells you to give it to those who are sick. I'm not sure about that exact verse, but I've had some people say, what about? And I don't know really how to answer it.
Well, yes, the first part, yes, they did have a means of preservation from season to season. They boiled it until it became syrup. And a lot of times it's thought that when the Bible speaks of honey, in some places it's talking about that and not what we think of as bees' honey. That it could be that boiled, they basically thicken it. They reduce it down so it's so thick and the sugar content is so high that it can't spoil. Then they cap that off with wax or whatever. I mean, a lot of the old folks around here canned with wax. And they'd cap that off with wax and it would be good for indefinitely, really. So yes, they did have a way of preserving basically fresh juice. Then when they would reconstitute it later, they just add water back to it, mix it up, and they had basically fresh, they had a concentrate. We have concentrates now. You go to the grocery store, you can buy the little cans in the freezer section of orange juice and grape juice concentrate. And they did the same thing then. Now the second part was, you mentioned the... Yes, they did. Fermentation can only happen with man's intervention. Naturally, spoilage occurs. So man has to add sugar or some fermenting. There has to be additives. There has to be a man has to have his hand in it for it to ferment. Naturally, it's going to just rot and spoil. Of course, our grape juice and stuff today, what you buy in the store is so full of added sugars and things like that. Can't really use that as an example. But the third part of that was, what about? Yeah, and it's talking about, I guess the thing, and that's the hardest one. And I think there may be, I think that gives us room, and we don't do that now. It's not talking about giving them a bottle of liquor down their feeding tube, because I know that happens. But what do we do at end of life in our day? We make them comfortable. That's the term that's used. We make them comfortable. And so you have medications and things that's come along. I believe when it is a definite end-of-life situation, there may be room for something along that line as a medicinal relief, pain relief. Now that you got to be careful with that, because that can't become an excuse either. I know a man, personally knew him, was on a feeding tube, and his kids, adult sons, were bringing in bottles of liquor and pouring in while he's laying in the bed. Now that was an end-of-life case, but there's still no excuse. So you have to be careful with that. But now, nobody thinks twice about modern medicine and end-of-life care. But they didn't have morphine. They didn't have, what did they have? Well, they had alcohol. And I would say in some instances, there may be room for legitimate end-of-life easing of pain or that sort of thing. I guess that would be the answer to that. Paul told Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake. I don't think that was necessarily fermented wine either. I think that would be just, I don't think Paul would open the door for drunkenness. And so, Timothy, well, how much? Well, just a little. Well, how much is a little? And that's the argument you get into is, well, I'm not getting drunk, I'm just having a little. That's the argument. Well, how much is, who defines it? And how do I define whether you're drunk or not? Well, God knows. Well, yeah, just a couple. How many of you had a drink tonight, sir? Just a couple. Just not many, just a little. So it's I don't think even that. I think you got to understand they had three choices. They had water, an occasional milk, and juice. That was their three choices. And I tell you what, if you go for a year and drink nothing but water and then go chug a bottle of grape juice, see what happens. That's what Paul meant when he talking to Timothy. You're having these stomach issues, take a little bit and it'll help kind of get things going here. As a probably a laxative effect. Does that make sense? So it wasn't, and people try to make the excuse today, well, wine's good for you if you just have a little. Well, grape juice is too, so you didn't have and there it is too, taking it in its cultural context. What did they have? Well, they didn't have what we have today, and it was a different time, different culture, different things. And you try to take the Bible and put it into 21st century America, it's a whole different thing. It's a whole different thing. Anything else?